Cohen, maybe a member of our JCCA family. Here now people are starting to pop in. Okay. Oh, wrong Sam Cohen. We have a Sam Cohen who looks a little different from you, but hi, happy to see you.
I'm the other Sam Cohen.
You're the other Sam Cohen, as long as you know, or she's
Yeah,
the other Sam
I'm
Cohen. It
very
depends.
aware that I'm the other one.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to get started. And if people are a little bit late, I guess they'll miss me with the boring introductions and they won't miss the really important stuff because we really do want to try to accomplish a lot in this hour. So first of all, hi, everybody. I'm Andy Mizels. I'm with the JCC Association. I'm the director of the Martin Pear Israel Fellowship. I want to welcome everybody, and I also want to, including my colleague Sarah Sless from our Center for Israel Engagement, staying up for us in Jerusalem or nearby. You're in the session that is called Israel-Palestinian Conflict 101. And this is a program of the JCC Israel Academy. And before we get rolling, and I will introduce Steve, our speaker, in a minute, I just want to explain what the Academy is. I hope you're aware and that you've been reading about it. But for those who haven't, the JCC Israel Academy was developed in response to what we were hearing in the field. Since October 7, we were learning that people wanted more opportunities to engage with Israel and be better informed about Israel and to find a way to follow the news more effectively and efficiently to be better informed. There's a few ways people have entered the Academy. There are several of these one-time sessions like we're doing today. There are some multi-session programs. There's one going on now that's a deeper dive into what Steve is going to miraculously try to not do in one session, but it's a deeper dive into some of the headlines that he's going to give us. And then there are these grants that we've been offering that allow you to help you to bring Israel-related speakers or artists or other related programming to your community. These are through the end of the year. We have several wonderful programs upcoming. I'll talk about those at the end because, again, I really do want to get started. And we hope you're following your mail, and we'll continue to update you on these things. So welcome. This is the second offering of the JCC Israel Academy, one of the short-term one-shot programs. And we're delighted to have with us a good friend of JCC Association, Steve Klein. Dr. Steve Klein is an educator. He's a journalist. He has a PhD in conflict management and negotiation. What are you doing here, Steve? You should be negotiating conflicts and managing them. From Bar Ilan University, he's an adjunct instructor at Tel Aviv University. He's a senior editor at Haaretz English newspaper, an Israeli newspaper, with many articles pertaining to Israeli society, social political conflict. This is the guy. He's taught for lifelong learning programs at Brandeis, Case Western Reserve, Duke, and the Skolnick Adult Institute. And if you are lucky enough, we can actually put the link in. Take a look at his blog, Another Take with Steve. Really good reading, worthwhile, thoughtful reading. And he lives with his family in Israel, his beloved family in Israel, he notes in his bio. And I will say that Steve has done several sessions with the Martin Pear Fellows, both cohorts. And people have really learned a lot from him and appreciated the way that he's able to contextualize very complicated situations. So just two last words for me, and then I'm going to hand it over to Steve. So the title, as the title suggests, it's 101, right? So this session is intended to help people better understand the conflict on the ground. For some people, that means I have been following, and it helps me to just keep doing this over and over because it clarifies things, or I learn something new every time. And for some people, it's all incredibly confusing. So we have 60 minutes, and now I've wasted 5 of them. But in 60 minutes, we can't do everything. Steve cannot talk about 75 years of Israeli history and what came before that and what came since 1948 and Israeli statehood. We can't talk about every component of the conflict. Steve is going to frame things for you to try to put the current conflict in some kind of context, if that's helpful to you, right? It's called 101, by the way, for a reason. There are no prerequisites. If there are things that come up that you don't understand, Sarah and I will be very quick on the trigger to try to provide translations or explanations, although Steve is very good about that. And we want to provide a lot of time for questions because that may be more helpful to you. So the plan is for about 35 to 40 minutes, Steve will present to us. Then we'll open up for questions. We'll talk about that, when we get there, how to do that. But he's going to try to give a bit of a roadmap to understand where we are today and maybe help you understand the news a little bit. It's really hard to come in and out. It's hard to follow every detail. And you're here because you are concerned and you want to know more, and we want to help you know more. And that's why we brought in this expert. Okay, so that's what we're here for, to help people understand. There are no bad questions here when we get to that point. Nobody needs to feel embarrassed. Everybody is coming in from a different background. And I want to mention one more thing. We're officially scheduled for an hour. Steve has very generously offered to stay on a bit after the official hour for people who have additional questions or didn't quite understand something. It's a great opportunity. So if you have the time and you have those questions, stick around. And that is enough from me. I'm happy to send this over to Dr. Stephen Klein. The screen is yours. Bevakasha.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, for the introduction. You see, Julie Holdaway wants to enter the room, so let's let her in too. So
we let her in. She's in.
She's in, great. Okay, excellent. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. After that wonderful introduction, I'm just going to move on ahead. And the way I want to frame this presentation that I'm giving is that, as Andy said, I can't teach you the conflict in 40 minutes. It would take me 75 years to do that. And then I would only give you one side of the conflict. I need another 75 years for a different perspective. And there are all kinds of different groups because we live in a very complex system with many different players and figures involved in this, many different perspectives. And so what I am going to try to do is, besides giving you some of those basic notions, ideas, and open up for discussion, also is to give you a chance to try to give you some tools so that you can then move on your own and to analyze the conflict. And that if you get into discussions on the conflict, I hope these tools will give you perspective that you can share, because we have a tendency to get dragged into discussions where they become very positional. Someone says, I like this, I'm for this, I'm against this, and then you start trying to engage in information. You're looking up on the internet to try to find something to refute the other person there. And those are very fruitless discussions. Rather, what I try to do and try to encourage people is that if you're looking at a problem, instead of looking at it face to face and arguing over the essence of the problem by taking positions, try to be shoulder to shoulder, look at the problem together and try to think, well, what do we see? What are we missing? What can we see from, what did they see from there that we might not be seeing from here? I think that can be a more productive way. So I'm going to share my screen. And I guess Andy and Sarah will keep track of questions, whatever, and we'll get to them. But other than that, I'm going to talk for the first half an hour or so. Okay, this should be okay. Everyone sees the screen okay? Great, okay. All right, so the first thing is that, as I say, there's no way to simplify this conflict. There's lots of people out there on the internet who go and say, oh, it's very simple. This is all we have to do. If we just do this, we can get this result. And I think that if that were really the case, we would have solved this by now. And the fact that it isn't is a reflection of a reality that all conflicts cohabit in, is the complexity. And so therefore, I actually want to start with complexity science. I can only see a few of you there. So I'm sure many of you are not necessarily aware of complexity science, but the idea of complexity science is that we live in systems that are complex, and that this complexity is where we're on the edge of chaos, and we're moving in between chaos and having an order, and that's where complexity exists. It's where where behaviors act. Just you might be able to even relate how you have your ideas, someone else has their ideas, but you're shaped by your own lived experiences. I think we have to silence some of them. And since we all have different lived experiences, we come out with different we come out with different conclusions. But the complexity science comes from going back. It's also related to chaos science. If anyone is familiar with the whole butterfly effect, which had to do with literally a weatherman who was looking at computer systems, and he noticed that if you change just a little bit, if you round off the numbers in your computer system, you get a completely different weather model prediction of what would happen there. So what we see is that in these complex systems, tiny changes can lead to large consequences. And so when we do something, we try to, we think we can predict the future, we think we can control the future, but it doesn't work that way because our lives are based on relationships, and our very presence inside the model affects things. Like, I'll give you another example. If any of you ever heard of, like, with polling, right? People talk about, oh, the polls get it wrong. One of the problems with polls is that the moment that a poll gets released, it changes everyone's perspective, because someone sees something and they say, oh, this person's winning, this person's losing, so they stop backing that person. And so every time we engage in the system, we change it, and we don't even know how we're going to necessarily change it there. And so through these interactions, these new phenomena emerge that we could not have predicted they were going to be. In the context of this, oh my goodness, there's my daughter there, hold on a second. In the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can look at it the whole history, that there are these phenomena that emerged that just a year or two before they came out, no one had any idea that they would come. But once they did, people look back and say, oh, that was inevitable. The Zionist movement, the PLO, Hamas, all these groups, once upon a time, not in the not too distant past, did not exist, and no one predicted that they were going to emerge. But once they emerged, people look back and say, oh yeah, that was inevitable. So there are certain rules of complexity that I'll go over here quickly here. One is numbers matter, and one of the best how should I say it, examples is an ant colony. So I'll use that numbers matter. The more you have, the more complex the system. If any of you ever dealt with like an ant colony, or bought an ant set, when you have a lot of colonies, when you have a lot of ants, they form food lines, and they bury their dead outside the colony. They engage in all kinds of behavior. But once there's only a few of them left, that whole system breaks down. And these interactions happen actually locally, not globally. We're very aware of conspiracy theories. And part of the reason why there are conspiracy theories is that when something big happens, people say, someone must have planned that. Someone had this in mind. But that's not actually how it happens. A lot of times when these phenomena emerge, they weren't necessarily planned. For example, a food line with ants, no one planned the food line. No one said, oh, there's a piece of sugar over there. I'm going to send 1,000 ants to get there. It starts with one ant finding it, bringing it back, laying down a trail of pheromone, and then other ants follow that fading trail to the sugar, and before you know it, there is a food line. Now, there's also the third rule is that you need to have a negative feedback, and they need to prevail to keep the system going and keep it healthy. Again, with the food line, if the pheromones that the ants laid never faded, then every ant would jump on board, and they'd be going back and forth on this line, even after the food disappeared, and then eventually the colony would collapse. And the last rule of complexity is that the degree of randomness is key. If you have too much, the system can't self-organize. If no ants know how to follow a food line, so they'll never be able to bring food back to the queen ant. But if there's too little, it can't adapt. If every ant would get on that food line, and no other ant was looking for food, so when that food source would run out, then the colony would also collapse there. And what's interesting about this complexity is that the same forces that keep the system going, and they also keep the system in check, they can also lead to the destruction of the system as well. And so they keep things in the system that are alive, even things that might seem destructive, but they keep them alive as well. Now, I also want to share with you some of my, where am I coming from when I'm giving you my view, because I can't transfer my brain over to you. I take a view of humanity, which is backed by the science, actually research here, which is relevant to conflicts, is that in general, regardless of conflicts, all human beings, we want to avoid suffering. We may think we need to suffer now, but it's for a goal, like no pain, no gain, right? So you suffer now because you'll feel so much better later. But your long-term goal is you want to avoid suffering. And our suffering derives from our dissatisfaction. You look at the system, there's something we don't like about it, we want to change it, we feel this discomfort, we're suffering, we want to end that suffering. But in trying to end our suffering, we might end up cause others to suffer. And in doing so, we're trying to end our suffering, but we're causing others to suffer along the way. And when that happens, when we consciously try to hurt other people for what other reason, we want to punish someone, we actually end up hurting ourselves. And again, you'll have to trust when this is checked in by the science. And when someone does terrible things, it also does, you might not feel the exact same thing if you're inflicting pain on someone, but there's a mental, emotional price that the perpetrator pays. And so this is a characteristic of conflict. Now, transitioning to the conflict at hand, I also want to give a framework here in that many of you have probably heard, especially since October 7th, different stories about the conflict, different narratives trying to explain what's going on. I'm not talking about an individual act, but to try to characterize the system as a whole and the story as a whole. And in so doing, one of the narratives have a positive aspect and a negative. The positive is narratives allow us to ingest stories that otherwise would be too complicated for us to understand. It allows us, by simplifying, we can learn more stories more quickly, and we can just kind of get through the stuff that, cut to the chase, as it were. But the downside of the narrative is that they flatten reality. And so there's a complexity in life that we miss out on. So if you ever heard someone say, well, the conflict boils down to this, right? What they're doing is that they're filtering out any things that might contradict their narrative because they want to give you a very simple message there. But when we look at narratives, and this is also something that's been shown in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when we look at Israeli Jews and Palestinians and polls about their opinions about the conflict, about themselves, about the other, we find common themes that they tend to mirror each other. So this is what I call the narrative quadrant. Now, I'm not talking about individuals because people can have very complex thoughts. So I'm talking more about, say, the simple narrative that you're going to hear from maybe in the media or maybe from a politician who's trying to, again, boil down the conflict in a way that you can digest it and you can accomplish the goals that whatever the politicians want you to do. So in one quadrant, there's what do we think about ourselves? We tend to think, right? We think that we're good. We think that we're right. We may think that we are victims if there's a conflict, that we're the victims in the conflict, that we have a just cause, that we care, so and that what we're doing is we're trying to be lawful, and even people who are breaking the law, they'll find some kind of rationale why it's actually okay what they're doing there. That's what we think about ourselves. What do we think about the others? In a process called schismogenesis, which is the process of groups growing apart from each other, we tend to think the opposite. The opposite. We'll describe those others as evil or bad. What they're doing is wrong. They're the ones, they're the ones to blame for what's going on. They're the perpetrators. Their cause is unjust. They don't really care about themselves. They don't care about their people, and that they're criminals, basically. The irony is, if you would go to the other side and ask them what they think about themselves, they think about themselves exactly what we think about us. And if you ask them what they think about us, they think about us exactly what we do. So there are these contradictory things going on. Now, there are people in the middle, and that's this middle here. Generally, it's the minority, or otherwise they would be the predominant narrative there. And these are people, humans, who may have multiple identities, like intersectionality. They may have no identity whatsoever, or they have what's known as a supra-ethnic identity, which is they find something that unifies the conflicting groups and see something bigger, that we are all Israelis, or we're all human beings, whatever it might be. In the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this involves people who are, say, like in the peace camp. It involves a lot of Israeli Arabs, because Israeli Arabs are holding both an Israeli identity and a Palestinian identity simultaneously. And these people are also, there's also an element, going back to complexity, it's an element of randomness. You're never going to have unity. You're never going to have everyone believing the same thing. There are always individuals who are going to go against the grain, and they will put themselves in the center. They simultaneously belong to a group, but they also belong to no one, or they might belong to multiple groups. So it's still a complex system here. Now, I want to ask you all, what are, we can take a couple comments, I think, is since October 7th, what are the narratives that you've heard recently? Because I want to give us some meat to work with. And so I presume that in your work, you've come across some of these things. So I'm talking, I'm not talking about an individual event, but like a story about what's going on. When people try to summarize the conflict, what have you heard? Can we take a couple of take a moment to think about that? Maybe one
Do you
about
want us to just
the Israeli.
Just
share.
call out if you want
Yeah.
to make a comment. Any hands? Are we seeing any hands? A lot of
Nothing.
people
Yeah,
are-
I think so. I
Talking.
think Natalie, but you need to unmute yourself.
sorry, I think
Yeah.
I was joined on my phone and now I'm not. One of the narratives that I've heard a lot that I don't necessarily that I don't subscribe to, but that's very much in the ether, is this settler colonialism
Yes.
critique of Israel.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent one. The settler colonialist narrative, saying that Israel is a settler colonialist state, it just pulls away all the complexity of all the story of why is settler colonialism generally is associated with imperial powers who were trying who saw resources, and they were fighting this great diplomatic battle in Europe, and they saw these places in Europe and Africa as resources to help them fight their battle. And it's ignoring any of the complexity of why Jews chose Palestine, because they felt the historical connection, and they were not looking at a place which was necessarily it wasn't abundant resources. They weren't going there for the gold and the diamonds and the oil, for sure. So yeah, that's an excellent example. Another example, let's take one more, just so we have what we're kinds of things we're thinking about. Sam, the other Sam.
I hear often the narrative is described as oppressor versus oppressed, or
Yes.
in other words, like a group that has power and a group that does not have power.
Yes, exactly. And the assumption is the oppressor, when you reduce the identities to oppressor and oppressed, the oppressor is by definition evil, and the oppressed is by definition good. And there's nothing redeemable that that oppressor can do to justify their situation, because anything they do is whitewashing. And there's nothing that the oppressed can do that is evil, because they're just responding to this situation where they're being made to suffer. And yeah, definitely, I think with October, did you hear in the context of like October 7th specifically, or? or the war in general?
Yeah, I would say specifically with the 7th, the viewpoint that the actions taken on the 7th were
Yeah.
justified resistance as an oppressed people.
Right, exactly, right. So that allows you to absolve you to actually look at what they were doing and the tremendous harm they were inflicting, and question whether or not there's any justification for that. Yeah, those are two very salient examples, and those are the kinds of things that are being fought over. But I think that, in terms of like a tool, when you encounter these things like settler colonialists or oppressor oppressed, is not to necessarily take. It's very hard, because I think those kinds of attitudes are very triggering. But you always want to. I could do a whole lecture on neuroscience and the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain and the adult brain and the child brain, but we're triggered and we want to react, and so you want to start arguing why that's wrong. But the problem you get into is that when someone says that, we think of it as being very simple. But the reality is that when they say that, that person who makes that statement, they believe that they are saying this after a whole life of lived experiences where this has brought them to this moment, and they brought to this conclusion. They believe that they have carefully considered all the facts without realizing how in their brain they may have assimilated certain information that there's a thing called confirmation bias, right? So in confirmation bias, you assimilate the information that matches your belief, and you filter out the information that that you didn't get. Or there could be a process. A lot of people, for example, I don't know if any of you encountered this in the JCC, but there's an issue of, say, young Jewish people, Jewish Voices for Peace or whatnot, who are who come out as anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, and obviously you can't accuse them of being anti-Semitic because they're Jewish. And if you dig into their stories, that's what you want to do, is you want to get into the story and think about, why do you think this? Like when you say settler colonialist, first of all, what do you mean? Because we might have different things involved. And how did you get to that conclusion? And why do you think that? It's like metacognition, because for some people, they might have been raised in a household that was very strongly Zionist. They always learned to, there's the Israel parade and to love Israel, not to question it. And the moment that they got to college, and what do you do when you're in college? Your job is to look critically, right? And the moment that they start uncovering facts and say, oh, they never told me this about Israel. And when they start hearing the bad things that Israel's done, that they were shielded from, their parents thought that they were doing them a favor by shielding them from this information that would make Israel look less than good. But in the end, it backfires, because now they say, well, if they lied to me about this, what else did they lie to me about? And then they start going to this thing, and then that leads them to something like the settler colonial narrative. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And that's so when people say that, they say it, they're not just, there are people who are say slogans. Like I've seen videos of people who said from the river to the sea, and then they say which river, which sea, and they can't even give an answer. But there are plenty of people, and you want to treat people with dignity and respect, and assume, when they say something, that they say it because there's some conviction behind it. But these narratives, though, just because they have conviction of it, doesn't mean that the narratives aren't problematic because of the superficial nature of it. So if I had 75 years to sit down with you guys, we would go over a historical review, right? Which we can break into different pieces. But the historical review, and a lot of people, I'll tell you this, I have seen it so much. And if you look also historically, when you look at famous speeches that were made by Yasser Arafat, if you know who he is, who was the head of the PLO, or Benjamin Netanyahu, they very often start with a history lesson. But what's interesting about these history lessons is that they very often, there's a question of, where do you start your story, right? So if we start our story, as I say, we Jews start their story with, the first, with Moses and the first temple, and the second temple. Palestinians will start their story with the Muslim conquest in the 7th century there. And we start our story depending on which story we want to tell. So even just here, there are, these broad periods. So, if you want to go back to the last time there was Jewish sovereignty, you have to go back 2,000 years. And then you had these different eras like the Roman, Byzantine era, the Muslims, the Crusaders, the Ottomans. And then finally you get to this era, what I call the Ottoman Reform era, where the Ottoman Empire started opening up and the imperial powers started getting involved. And this is where the beginning of, the settler colonial narrative begins. When you have this involvement of these foreign powers. And I can even tell you from a personal family history story that the involvement of the foreign powers was a big deal. My great-grandfather wrote a memoir. He was born in Palestine. He was born in the city of Tzfat in 1855. But in his memoir that he wrote in the 1930s, he was very proud of the fact that he had obtained Austrian citizenship for the family, because that exempted the family from all obligations to the Ottoman regime. So, there was definitely influence there. Then you've got the British era when the British took over, and this is a very formative period with two different stories from the Palestinian perspective. This is when everything went wrong because, the British imperialists basically took over the country, handed it over to the Jews against the will of the majority. For the Jews, they see this as the fulfillment of historical narrative in which the international community recognized the Jews' historical rights to the land, only to be betrayed by the British. Again, right, both sides are victims here in the story. And then we move into the modern era. There was between 48 and 67 when the West Bank was controlled by Jordan and Gaza was controlled by Egypt. So it was, historic Palestine was divided between these three countries. And that ended in 1967. And the Six-Day War is a very formative period, a very formative event, because it united everything under one regime, the Israeli regime controlling, Israel as well as the West Bank and Gaza. That lasted for the next quarter century. Then about 30 years ago is when the Oslo era began. The Oslo era is the era that was when Israel and the PLO, which I'll review in a second, signed a historic peace agreement, a memorandum of understanding, to try to solve the conflict peacefully. And that went on for about, it really lasted only about 7 years, and then there was a if anyone's heard of the Intifada, there was an Intifada before Oslo. And then in 2000, there was a second Intifada, which was a Palestinian very violent uprising. And that's when the peace process fell apart. And then we get to the latest era, which is 2007, which is when Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip. And that's a situation that we were living on October 7th, or the eve of October 7th, with the West Bank being controlled by what's known as the Palestinian Authority, Gaza being controlled by Hamas, Israel being controlled by Israel here. So who are the political players? And I just, again, we're not going to go into all the history, but I just want to have it there as reference, that you can see that these modern parties, the modern players, they all derive from, as I was talking about, emergent phenomenon, that in this complex system at different points in history that you can see through the years in red, each movement arose in response to something else. I don't have time to go into it, but I just want you to have that impression there. And so the main players that we're talking about now are the Israeli government, which is made up of three different segments. You have the Likud party, which is the traditional nationalist party in Israel. You have the religious Zionism, which is the pro-settler movement, and they're religious but also Zionist, and very fervently pro-Greater Israel. And then you have the ultra-Orthodox Jews, also known as Haredim, which are traditionally not Zionist, but they are still nationalist in terms of Israel there. Oh, sorry. And on the Palestinian side, you have the original, this is Mahmoud Abbas. He is the leader of Fatah, and Fatah is the main Palestinian movement which dominates the Palestinian Authority ruling in the West Bank. And then you have Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas, which has been around since 1987, but they took over, as I said, in 2007 there. Now, there are these competing narratives that were happening even before 2020, before 2021. So I want to focus on the main narratives, and I have videos, but I don't think we have time for them. One is Israel has had a very strong security narrative that since Hamas took over in 2007, the goal of Israel has been to, I mean, it's always been the goal of Israel, and it's continued, is first and foremost to preserve Israeli security. So Israeli security meant trying to cut off Hamas, trying to, there's been a siege around Gaza since 2007, responding every once in a while when there would be too many rocket fire or some kind of incident, there would be a war. So there's been about, even before 2023, there were 4 or 5 different major conflicts that erupted between Israel and Hamas. And the goal was always, we wanted to deter them. If we just hit them hard enough, we can make Hamas become more practical. They'll understand. Even in 2021, the speech that Netanyahu says, he basically says, we have punished our enemies and they will think twice before attacking us again. Now, they did think twice and they thought of a different way to attack us. But that was the idea. So it was always trying to think about what you can do. And sometimes, for example, under Netanyahu, Israel allowed Qatar to give Hamas $1.2 billion. The idea was he thought that they were buying quiet for Israel. It backfired because a lot of that money was used for the planning of October 7th and the rockets. The Hamas narrative, this whole period since it took over, has been one of resistance. Yes, every once in a while there's a ceasefire, but it doesn't matter though, because as long as Israel is around, as long as there's a siege, there is a constant Israeli aggression, which means that we have the right at any moment to attack Israel because we are doing this in defense against Israeli aggression. So again, these are narratives that are officially different, but the end result is the same. Both sides saying that the other side is at fault for the violence, we need to deter them, and we have the right to attack them at any moment. Now they're all alternative narratives. Those are the main narratives. There are the emergent narratives of ones that emerged earlier and they've been smaller. So, for example, in the Israeli, I'm going to focus really on the Israeli side. Mostly, there's a messianic narrative that the West Bank is the historic Jewish homeland. That's why you have these groups that they've built all the tools from the Second Temple, because their plan is eventually to take over Temple Mount and to rebuild the temple and Temple Mount, because they believe that the 6-Day War was a sign from God that the Messiah is coming imminently and we have to prepare for Messiah. The last thing we can do is give up the West Bank. There's the practicality. People say, well, we just need a 2-state solution because that's the only way we can get along with each other. And then there's the peace narrative of people that really believe that we can't exist. It isn't just a cold peace, but we can actually have a warm peace if we can learn to live with each other. And that leads here, and I'm going to turn over to questions in a moment, because when we get to October 7th, how do we make sense of it? There's been a battle over the narrative. We hear people talking about no choice, right? Israel has no choice. They must destroy Hamas. We try to live without Hamas, but we must destroy them now. Self-defense, right? Everything we're doing is in the name of self-defense. And the Palestinians also say they're acting in the name of self-defense. Both sides see the other as an existential threat. Both sides accuse the other of committing genocide. Both sides say that this is a story of good and evil. Both sides say they have a right to do what they are doing in this war. The Palestinians have the occupation narrative. The Israelis obviously reject that. Again, also the colonialist narrative is one that's rejected, and the anti-Semitism one is what Israel accuses of the pro-Palestinian side, and the pro-Palestinian side denies it. So there is this battle going on for the narrative, and so when you see these stories, this is what people are doing. Everyone's trying to explain the conflict in a way to bring everyone onto their side to believe that this is how we need to move forward here. So you see, and each side sees the other in, they're filtering in a way that's confirmation bias and matches them. So the Palestinians see how what the Israelis are doing to them. There's the racism and the genocide, all these things. The Palestinian side is the other one. The other side, we need to, what Hamas did. In every generation, there are people who rise up against us. The Palestinians, you say you're indigenous. No, we're the indigenous ones. You came after us. We're the indigenous one. And the existential threat, like Netanyahu said, if they lay down their arms, there'll be no more war. But if we lay down our arms, there'll be no more Israel. So these are very, very strong narratives, and they leave very little room for nuance in a conflict to think about what are creative solutions. Rather, the narratives move along the idea that we need to, this is a fight to the end, and we can't really compromise here. And that leaves us with these unresolved issues. One is a ceasefire. There was that one ceasefire in November, but there hasn't been one since. Back and forth accusations. Both sides have accused the other side of the ones who are not serious, who want to keep going, and we can discuss that. There is the hostage issue that as time goes on, you're finding fewer and fewer alive. There are still 120 that are being kept, but the estimates are there may only be 50 who are actually still alive at this point. There is having just the future of Gaza, what's going to come of it. Israel talks a lot about the day after, but we're so far. It feels to me like, well, they talked about the day after in Vietnam, like what's going to happen the day after we topple Hanoi. Never happened. So they talk about it, and people have plans, and they talk about, should it be the Palestinian Authority? Should it be local families? Should it be the international community? But we really don't know, because we can't predict the future, because we don't know how things are going to, what emergent phenomenon are going to happen if we keep fighting. And then there's Hezbollah, which is in the north, because Hezbollah, that's an emergent phenomenon of this war. Hezbollah, for the first time, joined a war to help Hamas. They never did that before. And, and so people are wondering about, should we go to war with Lebanon, with Hezbollah? What would happen if we would? Would Iran join in? So that opens up a whole nother can there. So in conclusion, what I would say and what I would encourage you to think about is, there are no simple solutions. I'm not offering a solution because I'm not offering you an easy answer, because I just don't see it. We can't predict emergent behavior. People want to, we think in terms of, if we just do this, if we just, if Hamas was thinking, if we could just kill this many Israelis, or if we could just kill this many terrorists, or if we could have this many demonstrators, we could stop the war, we could topple the government. But you just don't know how the other side is going to receive the message that you're trying to send with your own behavior. And what I do encourage you is that when you have these conversations, and to be curious, what is it I'm missing when I hear someone with a different perspective? What am I missing and what am I weighing? And to be aware that there are things that we don't know, and we don't even know that we don't know them. And that's something that when people do that, and we have some more, as I call it, epistemic humility, it gives us some space to have a more calm and reasoned conversation. On that note, I'm going to stop my presentation. I want to thank you very much for your time. And let's take some questions or comments.
Thanks, Steve. Everybody, you can call out. We're a small enough group, or you can wave your hand, and we'll look to call on you, whatever is comfortable.
Okay. Yeah. Before you do, I want to answer one question actually from the Natalie asked this question about negative feedback loop. Yeah, that's something that it's very important. Let me explain a negative feedback loop this way, and you can all appreciate this because it's summertime. an air conditioner is a negative feedback loop. When the room gets too hot, air conditioner kicks on. When the room cools off enough, air conditioner turns off. It keeps a negative feedback loop, keeps a system within a certain range, keeps it from spinning out of chaos. If the heat would kick on when the temperature would get a certain amount, then you would get into a positive feedback loop that would just make it unbearable there. Cancer is a form of a positive feedback loop that it just keeps going until it kills the system there. So in a negative feedback loop, and actually in terms of international conflict, the United Nations actually, and a lot of Israelis aren't happy with the UN or Jews. The United Nations is a form of negative feedback loop in that the United Nations intervenes to prevent conflicts from spinning out of control. And there are two sides to this. Is that on the one hand, an accomplishment of the United Nations is that not one member state has disappeared since 1945, which is an accomplishment because in every generation before 1945, there were always countries disappearing, just as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania back in 1939-40. But part of the negative feedback loop is because it prevents things from destruction, the phenomenon of Hamas is able to survive partly because of the international system. That's part of the negative feedback loop. So negative feedback loop doesn't mean everything is good about it. It just means it keeps the system from spinning into chaos or going into a positive feedback loop. Okay, that was my answer there. Questions or comments about specifically with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the different players? Maybe there are uncomfortable conversations you had or things that you read that disturbed you.
There might even be small things that you just
Yeah.
would like a little clarity on. That's
Yeah.
okay too. It's a 101. Natalie, your hand was up.
Absolutely, Natalie, go for it.
Does anyone else have a question? I already asked one before I dive in. Okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's called the Nakba? I've, heard a lot more about that in recent times than I had ever heard before, and would just love some more context on
sure.
that.
Okay, right. The Nakba is the Palestinian term to refer to the war in 1948, what Israelis and Jews refer to as the War of Independence. The reason why they see it as a catastrophe was obviously because that is when between 700,000 and 800,000 Palestinians fled their homes under different circumstances and then were unable to return. So they see it, and the Nakba, I think, is that's an excellent, I think, example of a narrative which is something that like when you get involved in the positional bargaining, then you get into a fight of, oh well, the Palestinians, they left only because they thought they were going to come back and kill the Jews, and so why should Israel allow them to leave? And or the Nakba becomes the basis of the right of return, and so therefore the only answer is to allow all the Palestinians in. The Nakba really is an emergent phenomenon in that every individual left for all kinds of reasons in 1948, but there are estimates. If you want to do rough estimates, about a third of them fled during before 1948, before the war even broke out. People fled on their own just because, well, that's what people do. Like Ukraine, right? People fled Ukraine before the war because you're a civilian. You don't want to die. So I think that's a perfectly human emotion. There's about a third who fled Israeli forces out of fear because the Israelis were on the move, on offenses, and so they left before the Israelis would arrive. And about a third were forcibly transferred by the Israelis. So this becomes, in terms of the narrative, it becomes a basis for people arguing about the legitimacy or illegitimacy of Israel or the Palestinian movement. I see this as this is a human tragedy that happened. And so it's something I think you can recognize without fear. I think you can recognize the Nakba without delegitimizing Israel because of the suffering that the Palestinians felt. And then you can have a discussion about, well, what is the best way to, or what are the different options? Because when in an emergent phenomenon, you create these different, they're called the adjacent possible. There are different ways that this could be resolved. I would ask what would be the way to resolve it that would cause the least amount of suffering. But other people think in terms of, this is, justice, or this is what's right. And indeed, when you get stuck on those terms of justice and what's right, that can cause suffering in and of itself and lead to more conflict. Does that help? Yeah, okay, great. Okay.
Sarah, you want to
Sarah?
unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much for doing this. It's extremely helpful. So as far as I know, Israel disengaged from Gaza in 2005.
Yes.
So why are we keep hearing the narrative over and over again about the Israeli occupation of Gaza?
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's an excellent question. And my answer to you would be is that it's complex. So I'll try to break it down a little bit in that, first of all, there is the question of what was the intention of disengaging from Gaza. So the narrative that you might have heard in 2024 is, well, Gaza could have become Singapore, but but instead of turning into Singapore, Hamas just built tunnels and rockets. But no one asked Hamas when Israel left, what to do. And there was nothing in Israel. When Ariel Sharon left, he said nothing about Singapore. He just said, we are leaving because we no longer want to rule over these people. We know that if there will ever be a peace deal, we will not be ruling over Gaza. So there's no point in us being there. So we might as well leave. And now that's what he said. Palestinians are very sensitive to the fact that his personal advisor named Dov Weissglass, gave an interview that it's not clear whether or not he wanted this for public consumption, but it came out that he said that disengagement is like formaldehyde, because it will put the peace process in a permanent freeze. There was an intent. There was an intention among at least some Israeli leaders that disengagement wasn't a step towards peace, but rather a way to stop the peace process. Because what it meant is that you divide Gaza from the West Bank, and therefore you can't make peace with them anymore, because you've got Hamas here and there. So there's no partner for peace, and so therefore it gives Israel an excuse not to make peace. In terms of the narrative, why do people say that there's still an occupation? First of all, any Palestinian who wants to go in or out of Gaza, anywhere other than Egypt, they need Israel's permission. A Gazan cannot go to, if they want to go to, first of all, they've been banned from going to the West Bank since 2007. Before that, they needed permission. Gaza fishermen, if you want to fish, you need permission from the Israeli army or the Israeli Navy to go fishing. So when your life is controlled that way, you need, the electricity and the water comes from Israel, and every time there's a problem with the payment, Israel cuts off the water supply, the electricity supply. So when you don't enjoy independence like that, you are not fully autonomous, you don't control your own energy infrastructure, you can't use a seaport, you have no airport, you rely, all your residents rely on permission from, this other authority in order to leave the country. That feels like occupation to them. So that's why they feel occupation, and and having this wall there's control. They can't freely trade. There are also agreements between, they see Israel and Egypt as being in cahoots with each other. So yes, Egypt is Arab, but Egypt is also very fiercely anti-Islamist. And so Egypt has a lot more interest from a security and political perspective with Israel than it ever has or ever will with Hamas. So in that sense, that's why to them, the occupation never ended.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
It's kind of partially formed, but thank you very much for sharing all this knowledge. I think I appreciate that you're framing it from this place of complexity, because it is so hard to understand and to like see a path forward.
Yeah.
And I think something that I frequently struggle with when I'm engaging in conversation about the war, or about Israel-Palestine generally, is, like you said, there people are coming at it from very wildly different basis of their knowledge of the history, or what year they're defining the beginning of certain countries or certain peoplehoods. And the term Zionism to everyone you ask is a little bit different.
Yes.
So what are some strategies that you use to start a conversation with someone without asking well, what do you already know about it? How do you go about it without being rude,
Right.
or assuming that they don't know anything?
Yes.
Or what are maybe some resources that you recommend for folks that are trying to learn more but don't know where to start?
Okay. All right.
Steve, before you answer that excellent question, just know that we have about 2 minutes,
Okay.
3 minutes, and I need 30 seconds of it.
Okay, sure. Okay. All right. So for one thing, we actually have a 101 sheet. So I don't know if you did you send that out with the resources? Andy?
I sent the timeline out, not the.
Yeah, no, but there's a resource that we shared with the pair of fellows. Maybe with this group too, you could share it with them. So there is that. It's funny you asked that. I just had a group of Quakers over at my house a week ago. And there were people who were asking me questions, and saying things about Israel as a settler colonial state. It's like a beginning. So what I do is my strategy is I just try to be curious. And I try to leave everyone's dignity intact. I say, when you say that, what do you mean by that? Because we might have different definitions, So where does it come from? You can say, I'm going to push a little bit. Why are you confident? There's a methodology you can look it up on the internet called street epistemology. And there's a great book, by the way, I highly recommend. My favorite book is called How Minds Change by David McRaney. And if you follow David McRaney, he has a lot of good stuff about how to have more civil conversations. And it involves, it really involves curiosity. What do you mean by that? Maybe we have different definitions. When I talk about, I say, in my lived experience, I try not to talk in absolutes. I will talk about, I have a working hypothesis, rather than, this is a fact. You can ask them, what might you be missing? What might be coming from the perspective of the other side that would make them, believe that, So that's the way, I hope that's helpful in trying to do it there, is to try to get them to think about why they engage in metacognition. Why do you think what you think? Rather than you want to avoid getting into positions and saying, you're right, I'm right, you're wrong, and I have this internet article to prove it. Because they'll just find an internet article to prove you're wrong.
Before we thank Steve and do a do a bit of a commercial, Steve, maybe put your email, and I'll remind people that Steve is willing to hang out a bit if you'd like. Steve, why don't you put your email in the chat if people have questions? Steve is always great about engaging. And one of the questions you asked, Sam, and what Steve answered leads us to an option that you can take in September. We have a 4-part series coming up with Robbie Gringrass, another one of the great Israel educators in our orbit, who talks about how to have healthy arguments, how to discuss difficult things, how to engage with discourse with people who disagree with you. So you've asked for it. Here we are. Here it is. If you can spare those 4 weeks, I highly recommend it. We have also other short-term, one session sessions coming up. The next one is on social media in the current climate. I mean, go to the JCC Resource Center. You can also find suggestions for reading there, or you could write to either Sarah, Steve, or I, and we can also give you additional resources. There's plenty out there, and we're happy to provide it, send it, vet it, and get it your way. So before we officially end, Steve, I just want to thank you so much for being here, for your preparation, it's pretty uncanny. I mean, it's really hard every time I'm about to interrupt and say, I wonder if he knows we don't have enough time, you have figured out how to do it in the time, and then leave enough time for people to make those inquiries. So thank you. Thanks, everybody. Let us know if you want more, if there's other things we can give you, and we will answer those emails. And that's it. Enjoy.
Quick plug, because I do teach, I actually teach online a course on Israeli-Palestinian narratives. So
There you go. You can also find Steve online, and you can get more with him in more detail. So we're going to let you go unless you would like to hang around and ask our resident expert a couple more questions. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye. Oh, Natalie, got to unmute. I want to hear what you have to say.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, you answered my question, then I forgot the second part of it. So you said
Oh, go for
a
it.
third of folks left voluntarily, a third were forced out, and the middle was
Okay, yeah. But when I say voluntarily, I want to be very careful about that, because voluntarily in that they saw the writing on the wall, so it was really out of fear. Like, no one was pointing a gun at them.
yeah. But they saw what was coming and made the decision to leave ahead of war.
A third of them left because the war had already started, and they had seen what had happened to other places, and so they fled in fear of what would happen.
I see.
Then it was a very real fear, and then about a third were actually, like, literally marched out by the Israelis and dumped on the other side of the border. So that's
Yeah.
about now from the just as long as you're here, from the more simplistic narrative standpoint, Palestinians say it doesn't matter why they left. They're all victims, and the Israelis will say it doesn't matter why they all left. They were all ready to kill the Jews and drive them into the sea. So so it would be an existential threat to allow them in, right? So both sides, you can tell them the facts, and they'll still assimilate it in a way that will lead them to the same conclusion that, and I've done this with people. I said, even if we drove them out, would you then let them back in Israel? No, because they would be an existential threat, because they want to destroy Israel. So
People talk about at the point that it happened back then, or now, or both.
No, I'm talking about people today about it. Because look, in December, when the resolution was passed in December 1948, I don't think anyone imagined that 70 years later, 75 years later, they would all still be refugees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was more that there was an intention, and they thought they would come up with a system, but the system ended up perpetuating the refugee problem, and Israel didn't want to take them in, and so that's been a point of